When single dad Eric brings flowers to his daughter's kindergarten teacher, he becomes the butt of every PTA mom's joke. But when the teacher bursts into tears, the entire room falls silent and a story neither of them was prepared for begins. Like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe in second chances, unexpected love, and the healing power of kindness. Eric adjusted the rearview mirror for the third time, even though it was already centered. His hands gripped the steering wheel, fingers drumming nervously against the leather. Outside the windshield, the world bustled along like any other spring morning. Parents ushered children toward the elementary school gates, some walking hand in hand, others hurrying with juice boxes and backpacks. He watched them, then looked over at the bouquet resting awkwardly on the passenger seat. Yellow tulips. Not red roses, not fancy orchids. Just something simple, something cheerful. Something that felt like gratitude, or at least he hoped it did. In the back seat, Maya kicked her little pink sneakers rhythmically against her car seat, humming a song from the cartoons she watched on loop. She was 5, with a round face and a gap-toothed grin, and the most observant eyes Eric had ever seen. She caught him glancing at the flowers again and tilted her head. "Are those for Miss Grant?" she asked, with a curiosity. Only a kindergartner could make sound both innocent and accusatory. Eric nodded slowly. "Yeah, they are. It's Parent Appreciation Day today, right? Thought I'd say thank you." Maya beamed, pleased by the answer. She's gonna love them. She says tulips are her favorite. That struck him as a good sign, though he hadn't known it when he bought them. He'd picked them mostly because they reminded him of his mom, who used to plant tulips outside their front porch every spring. She had been a school teacher for 32 years, the kind of woman who always smelled like cinnamon and hand sanitizer. If someone had brought her flowers on Parent Appreciation Day, she'd have cried for sure. Still, as he pulled into the carpool lane and caught sight of the other parents bustling around, his confidence began to drain. The moms were dressed in clean jeans, fitted blazers, scarves that probably cost more than his whole week's groceries. They moved in tight clusters, laughing in that way that wasn't cruel exactly, but felt exclusive. A few of the dads were there too, but most sat in their cars, eyes glued to their phones or tapping away at dashboards. Eric stepped out of the car, flowers in hand, feeling every eye glance and turn. Someone snickered, he couldn't be sure who, and a voice from somewhere in the crowd mumbled, "Well, someone's trying a little too hard." He didn't look up. He reached for Maya's hand instead, squeezing her tiny fingers as they walked toward the school doors together. She was oblivious, still humming, still swinging her arm. To her, this was a regular Tuesday morning. For him, it felt like trying to walk through a storm in flip-flops. Inside, the hallway smelled of crayons and glue sticks and orange-scented cleaner. Drawings lined the walls, all in bright construction paper and glitter. At the end of the corridor was room 1A, and the door was wide open. Miss Lila Grant stood near her desk, laughing with a cluster of students and greeting parents with the warmth of someone who genuinely liked children. She was in her late 20s, maybe 30, wearing a soft navy dress with white polka dots and a cardigan that hung slightly off one shoulder. Her brown hair was pulled into a bun, a few strands loose around her cheeks. She looked up as Eric approached, her eyes meeting his, and then darting quickly to the tulips. He offered the bouquet with both hands, feeling a rush of uncertainty. "Hi. I just wanted to say thanks. For everything you do. For Maya. For all the kids. These are for you." Lila reached for the flowers, but stopped halfway. Her face went still. Something in her eyes shifted, like a film of glass cracking. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. Then, as if the dam broke all at once, her expression crumbled. She took the flowers gently, brought them close to her chest, and began to cry. It wasn't a quiet cry, not the kind you could mask with a polite smile or a tissue tucked into a sleeve. It was sudden, deep, and almost helpless, like a wave overtaking someone who wasn't ready for the tide. Her knees bent slightly, and she turned away, pressing the flowers to her face. Silence rippled through the classroom. One mother stepped back, uncertain. A few kids stopped playing with blocks and just watched, blinking. The air felt thick with the sound of withheld breath. Eric stood frozen. A pit opened in his stomach, swallowing any certainty he had. He'd done something wrong. That's what everyone was thinking, right? Who makes a teacher cry at 8 in the morning? "I'm sorry," he said instinctively, stepping forward. "I didn't mean to. I thought it would be a nice—" But Lila turned back to him, eyes rimmed with tears, and shook her head. "No," she whispered, voice raw. "It's okay. I wasn't expecting that." He nodded, still unsure whether he should walk out or offer to find her a chair. Maya looked up at him and whispered, "Did I do something bad?" Eric leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "No, sweetie. You did everything just right." One of the aides stepped over to gently guide the students toward a reading circle, giving Lila space. Eric glanced at the flowers, now resting on her desk. The stems looked a little wilted under the classroom's fluorescent lighting, and for a wild second he wished he'd chosen something else, or nothing at all. "I should probably go," he muttered. Lila didn't stop him, but she caught his wrist lightly as he turned. "Thank you," she said, her voice steadier now, though her eyes were still glassy. "Really?" He nodded, still unsure what had just happened, and walked out the door, Maya in tow. As they reached the car, he opened the back seat and helped her buckle in. "Is Miss Grant sad?" Maya asked, kicking her feet. Eric thought about it for a moment before answering. "Yeah, but I think maybe the flowers helped a little." He climbed into the driver's seat and pulled out of the lot, avoiding the glances from the same parents who'd watched him walk in. He didn't feel like the confident, intentional dad he wanted to be. He felt like a man who'd stepped on a memory too heavy for anyone to carry. Back home, he couldn't stop thinking about her face, the way she had looked at those tulips. Not like they were just flowers, but like they were something sacred, something lost that had suddenly returned. He had no idea what story was behind those tears, but for the first time in years, he found himself wishing he did. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toast as Eric stood leaning against the counter, scrolling through his phone. The mug in his hand had gone cold half an hour ago, but he hadn't noticed. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that morning, the expression on Lila's face, the sudden collapse of her composure, the tears that seemed to come from a place buried so deep it surprised even her. He had only wanted to be kind, to offer something small that might brighten her day. Now he felt as if he'd opened a door he had no right touching. Maya sat at the table with a coloring book, her brow furrowed in serious concentration as she tried to keep her crayon within the lines. Every now and then, she glanced up at him as if waiting for him to say something important. He smiled when their eyes met, but the weight in his chest wouldn't lift. After loading the dishwasher and tidying up the counter, he checked his email out of habit. Buried between a grocery store coupon and a forwarded newsletter from his brother was a new message. The subject line read simply, "Thank you for today." It was from Lila Grant. His heart jumped a little as he clicked it open. "Hi, Eric. I hope this isn't too forward, but I didn't want to let the day end without reaching out. I realized this morning was confusing, and I want to thank you again for the flowers. They meant more than I can explain. Today is the anniversary of my husband's death. 4 years ago, on this exact day, he passed away suddenly in a car accident. He was 32. He always brought me yellow tulips on special days, just because he knew I loved them. I haven't received a single one since he died not until this morning. When you handed me those flowers, I thought for a moment I was hallucinating, that somehow he was speaking through you. I know how strange that sounds, and I don't expect you to understand all of it. But I just want you to know, your gesture wasn't misplaced. It was deeply, powerfully received. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. Lila." Eric read the message twice, then a third time. The words sank in slowly, almost painfully, like a key sliding into a lock that hadn't turned in years. He found himself gripping the edge of the counter. A lump rose in his throat, and for a few moments he simply stared at the screen, unsure of what to do with the flood of emotion that welled up inside him. He had no idea. He could never have known. And yet, somehow, without intending it, he had placed something sacred in her hands. He sat down at the table across from Maya, who looked up at him curiously. "Did Miss Grant say anything?" she asked, resting her chin on her palm. Eric nodded slowly. "Yeah, she wrote me a note to say thank you. She liked the flowers a lot." Maya smiled, satisfied. "I told you she would. She always talks about tulips. And today she didn't give us spelling tests, so maybe the flowers made her happy." He smiled back, softer now, and reached for his laptop. After a moment of hesitation, he began typing a reply. "Hi, Lila. Thank you so much for writing. I'm so sorry about your husband. I had no idea, of course, but I'm honored that something so simple could hold that much meaning. I lost my mother a few years back. She was a teacher, too. I used to bring her tulips every spring. That's why I picked them. I didn't mean to intrude on something sacred. I only wanted to show appreciation for how kind you are to Maya, how patient and thoughtful. You're clearly someone who cares deeply. I admire that. If you ever want to talk, or just not be alone on a day like today, I'd be happy to listen. No pressure, just putting it out there. Take care. Eric." He read the message twice before hitting send, then leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't anything loaded. He just wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Later that afternoon, he picked Maya up from school. Lila wasn't outside, as she usually was. An aide handed Maya off with a polite smile, saying Miss Grant had stepped out early. That made sense. Maybe she had gone home to grieve, or maybe she just needed quiet. That night, after Maya went to bed, Eric sat on the couch staring at the television. The show played in the background, but he wasn't following any of it. He kept thinking about how fragile people were, how entire lives could be shaped by a single moment. He remembered how helpless he had felt when his ex-wife left him, packing her things in silence while Maya napped on the couch. There hadn't been a dramatic fight or angry words, just a quiet resignation that she wasn't cut out for this kind of life. He hadn't cried until 3 days later, and even then, it wasn't out of heartbreak. It was the sight of Maya's toy giraffe sitting alone on the kitchen floor that finally undid him. The ping of an email broke the quiet, and he reached for his phone. Lila had written back, "Hi again. I don't think you intruded at all. In fact, your message helped more than I expected it to. I've kept everything locked up for so long, not just the grief, but the fear of letting anyone see it. When you offered to listen, I felt something shift. It's been a long time since anyone asked if I wanted company on a hard day. Most people try to cheer me up or avoid the subject altogether. But you didn't. You just said it plain. That meant something. If you're still up for it, I'd like to buy you a coffee. As a thank you, no strings. Just a warm drink between two people who've carried things quietly for too long. Let me know if tomorrow works. After school, maybe?" Lila. He stared at the message for a long time, surprised by the weight of his own relief. It was more than gratitude. It felt like the opening of a door neither of them had realized they needed. A chance to acknowledge the past without being swallowed by it. He replied that he'd be happy to meet her. Coffee sounded good, simple, safe. He added a smiley face before deleting it, then added it again. The next day, he stood outside the school, with Maya's backpack slung over his shoulder, heart drumming in his chest. When Lila walked out the front doors, she looked tired, but lighter somehow. Her eyes found his, and for the first time, she smiled in a way that reached all the way through her. She nodded toward the sidewalk. "There's a cafe around the corner. They have terrible muffins, but the coffee's decent." Eric chuckled, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself feel the quiet stirrings of something unexpected. Not romance, Not yet. Just connection. Maybe that was where healing began. Not with declarations or dramatic gestures, but with tulips, and a cup of coffee, and a conversation waiting to be had. The cafe sat on a corner beneath an awning, the color of old bricks, with streaks of sun-bleached paint along the edges that made it look like it had been there for decades. Eric had passed by it a dozen times on the way to Maya's school, but had never gone inside. It looked cozy, in the way quiet places sometimes do when you're walking past with no reason to stop. Today, though, he had a reason. He opened the door for Lila, who stepped inside with a nod of thanks. The scent of freshly ground beans greeted them, layered with hints of vanilla syrup and something nutty, maybe almond. The place wasn't crowded, just a few regulars sitting with laptops or paperbacks. A man in a corduroy jacket tapped away at a keyboard near the window, and a pair of older women sat sipping tea from mismatched ceramic cups. A chalkboard behind the counter listed drinks in playful handwriting. Someone had drawn a cartoon pumpkin next to the seasonal latte. Lila moved toward a table near the back, just far enough from the others to give them space. Eric followed, pulling out her chair without thinking, then hesitated, unsure if that gesture would seem too formal. She gave him a grateful smile and sat without comment. He settled across from her, still feeling the ghost of the morning's nerves, but calmer now. Her presence helped. "Thanks for meeting me," she said as she unwrapped a scarf from around her neck. Her voice was softer than it had been at school, lower somehow, like she had turned a page in her usual script. "I almost talked myself out of it." "I almost did the same," he admitted. "But I figured I've already made you cry once this week. Might as well double down." Her laugh surprised them both. It wasn't loud, but it was real. It opened her face, revealed dimples that had been hidden behind the calm, teacherly expression she wore at school. For a moment, she looked younger. Or maybe just lighter. They ordered coffee, nothing fancy. He took his black with a splash of cream, and she added honey and oat milk to hers, like she'd been doing it for years. When the mugs arrived, warm and thick in their hands, it gave them both something to hold on to in the silence that followed. "It was 4 years ago yesterday," she said finally, cradling her mug. "The accident. He was driving back from work. A delivery truck ran a red light. They said it was instant, that he probably didn't feel anything." Eric nodded slowly. "I'm sorry. There's no good way to respond to that." "There really isn't," she agreed. "People always try to find one, though. My favorite was when someone told me God must have needed him more than I did." He winced. "That's awful." "It was," she said, but her smile was faintly amused. "I didn't slap them, though I thought about it. Grief makes you petty in weird ways." He sipped his coffee, letting her words settle between them. Outside, the sun angled through the window in sharp lines, catching the flecks of light in her eyes. She wasn't crying now, but there was a tightness at the corners of her mouth that hadn't completely softened. "You said he brought you tulips," Eric said, careful not to lean in too quickly. "Every year?" She nodded. "For our anniversary. For birthdays. Just because." He had no idea what made a good bouquet. Sometimes they were half-wilted or weird colors. But tulips were his favorite thing to get for me. Not roses, not lilies. He said they looked like little cups, like they were always waiting to catch rain. Eric smiled at that. "That's actually kind of poetic." "He wasn't poetic," she said. "He just noticed things other people didn't." There was a pause, not awkward but full. Eric took a breath and said, "My mom loved tulips, too. She taught 3rd grade in Chicago for 30 years. Used to tell me every spring that tulips were brave because they bloomed when the ground was still cold. She said that's how you knew they were the real thing. Not showy, just persistent." Lila glanced at him, and her eyes shimmered slightly. "That's beautiful. I never thought of it that way." "She was a good woman," Eric said. "Died a couple years ago. Cancer. Maya was just a toddler then." Lila traced a finger around the rim of her mug. "I always wondered if I'd still be teaching if She trailed off and he didn't press. "You don't have kids?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "We were trying. Then we stopped trying and started planning. And then it was just me." There was no bitterness in her voice, only fact. Eric appreciated that. He had lived through enough of his own unraveling to know when someone had come to terms with pain, even if the scars were still sensitive. "My daughter," he said. "She thinks the world of you, draws pictures of you with capes and sparkles." Lila laughed again, but this time it turned into something more tender. "She's special. She listens. Most 5-year-olds don't, not really. But Maya watches. It's rare. She gets that from her mom," he said. Then, after a beat, he added, "Her mom isn't really around anymore." Lila looked at him, not pitying but understanding. "I'm sorry. Was it recent?" 2 years, he said. "She left. Said she needed to find herself. I guess she thought marriage and motherhood got in the way of that." Lila nodded slowly. "That must have been hard. For both of you." "It was," he said, then corrected himself. "Still is some days. But Maya keeps me grounded. I guess we're finding our rhythm." They sipped their coffee in silence again, but it didn't feel heavy this time. It felt like a pause between breaths. Outside, the light shifted slightly, and a wind stirred the leaves along the sidewalk. Lila set her mug down and leaned forward slightly. "I haven't talked about him in months. Not like this. People get uncomfortable when you bring up the dead." Eric tilted his head. "I'm not uncomfortable." "I know," she said. "That's what's strange." He smiled, not sure what to say to that, but grateful nonetheless. He watched her as she sat back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. The weight she carried hadn't vanished, but it had eased its grip. He didn't pretend to understand everything she had been through, but sitting there with her, sharing stories in silence, he felt something beginning to stir. Not infatuation, not even attraction in the typical sense. It was recognition. Like meeting someone who had walked through a different fire but come out with the same kind of burn. When they finally left the cafe, the sky had turned a richer blue, and the breeze had picked up. They walked side by side toward the school parking lot, their steps unhurried. As they reached her car, she paused and looked at him. "I'm glad we did this," she said. "Really?" He nodded. "Me too." She opened her door, then turned back to him. "I'm not ready for anything more, just so you know." "I'm not asking for anything more," he said. But as she got into her car and drove off, he stood watching for a while. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, but it lingered, a warmth, a shift, a quiet possibility that maybe, just maybe, something new had started to bloom. The air around the school playground was filled with the usual hum of parents chatting, kids yelling across the monkey bars, and teachers trying to maintain a semblance of order while letting the children burn off the last of their energy. It was Thursday, pickup time, and Eric stood near the fence watching Maya hang upside down from the low bar with her tongue sticking out. She had inherited none of his cautiousness. Her fearlessness made him proud, and also terrified. He kept a casual eye on the other parents, not out of nosiness, but because it was hard to avoid the feeling of being watched. Ever since the morning, with the tulips and the unexpected tears that followed, something had shifted. He had felt it immediately afterward, and even more so in the days since. At first, he thought it was just the weight of that emotional moment, a hangover of meaning that lingered quietly between him and Lila. But now he realized it wasn't just that. Other people had noticed too. It started small, with a couple of the moms tilting their heads just a little too long in his direction. Then came the whispers. Not loud enough to catch full sentences, just clipped tones and glances. He had picked up a few words by now. Inappropriate. Too familiar. Not professional. Always spoken in low voices, behind turned backs or into cupped hands, but never far enough for him not to hear the hum of judgment. He tried to shrug it off. The school was a tight-knit place. mostly made up of families that knew each other from the neighborhood or church or old PTA committees. Eric had moved here just 2 years ago, and even though he volunteered for classroom cleanups and baked cookies for holiday parties, there was always a quiet sense that he didn't quite belong. Now, it seemed that delivering flowers to a grieving teacher had made him a topic of interest. When Maya came running up with her backpack bouncing, he crouched to catch her in a hug, swinging her slightly to the side. "Miss Grant says we're going to do a class garden," she announced breathlessly. "We get to plant our own flowers." He smiled and adjusted the straps on her bag. "Yeah? What are you going to grow?" "Carrots," she said immediately, though he was pretty sure carrots didn't grow well in shallow kindergarten soil beds. But that wasn't the point. She was excited, and he was glad to see her that way. Lila appeared near the school doors a moment later, speaking with another teacher before waving goodbye and heading toward her car. She caught Eric's eye as she passed the playground and offered a small, discreet smile. It was brief, but real. Maya noticed. "Are you and Miss Grant friends now?" she asked as they headed toward the parking lot. Eric hesitated. "I think so, yeah." "Good," she said. "She needs more friends. Grown-ups get lonely too." The wisdom of children, he thought. It always hit harder than expected. At home that evening, after dinner and homework and a bedtime story, Eric checked his phone while tidying up the kitchen. There was a message from Lila. "I heard something today. Thought you should know. A few parents made comments to the principal about us spending time together. Nothing formal, just suggestions that it's inappropriate. I'm okay, just annoyed. Wanted to give you a heads up." He stood still for a moment, letting the words settle. The irritation flared quickly. It wasn't anger at her. It wasn't even fully anger at the parents, though that was part of it. It was the injustice of it all, the assumption, the way people felt entitled to dictate what was acceptable grief, what was allowed healing, and who had the right to show kindness. He typed out a reply and then deleted it. He didn't want to sound defensive. Instead, he tried again. "Thanks for letting me know. I'm sorry this is turning into a thing. I don't regret the coffee, or the flowers, or any of it. Let me know if you want me to pull back. I'll respect whatever you need." A few minutes later, her response came. "You don't need to pull back. I just need to be careful. This job is the only thing I've had that's steady since he died. I won't risk it. But I don't want to pretend nothing's happening either. Not between us." He read that last line twice. It was the first time she had said it out loud, that there was something happening between them. He stared at the phone for a while, then turned it face down on the counter. The next afternoon he arrived a little earlier for pickup. Maya had forgotten her water bottle that morning, and he figured it was a good excuse to stop by the classroom. When he got there, the door was open, but the room was mostly empty. Just a few kids waiting for their parents and Lila at her desk, sorting a pile of worksheets. She looked up and smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I brought this," he said, holding up the pink water bottle. "Rescued it from the back seat before it exploded." She chuckled softly and walked over to take it. Their hands brushed briefly. "You doing okay?" he asked. She nodded, then shrugged. "I'll survive, but I won't lie. It stings, being judged for simply talking to someone. Grieving people are supposed to stay quiet and not make anyone uncomfortable." He didn't know what to say that wouldn't make it worse, so he just listened. "I talked to Mrs. Bailey," she continued. "The principal. She was understanding, but she also reminded me to be mindful of perceptions, which, let's be honest, is code for don't give anyone a reason to complain." "I hate that," he said. "Me too," she admitted. There was a long pause. Then she glanced at the clock. "I'm stopping by your place later," she said, her tone shifting. "Maya left her art folder in the reading nook. I was going to drop it off after dinner, if that's okay." He nodded. "Of course, anytime." Later that evening, after Maya had finished dinner and was brushing her teeth with foam all over her chin, the doorbell rang. Lila stood on the porch, holding the red folder and a small container of muffins. She looked tired, but more at ease than she had been earlier. I figured if I'm already being accused of playing favorites, I might as well deliver art and snacks, she said, trying to smile. He stepped aside to let her in. The light in the hallway caught the curve of her jaw, the softness around her eyes. She smelled faintly of lavender and something citrus. They sat in the kitchen while Maya finished her nightly routine. The conversation was light, almost normal. It danced between school updates, childhood stories, and a debate about whether raisins belonged in cookies. It wasn't a date. It wasn't dramatic, but there was something easy about it, something healing. When Maya finally came down in her pajamas and saw Lila at the table, she grinned so wide it almost split her face. "Miss Grant, you're in our kitchen!" Eric laughed. Lila stood and crouched to give Maya a hug. "I came to bring your folder," she said, holding it out like a treasure, "and some blueberry muffins. You better save one for your dad." "I'll save two," Maya promised solemnly. After a few more minutes of goodbyes, Lila walked toward the door. Eric followed. On the porch, she turned to him, her face quiet. "I like being here," she said softly. "You're always welcome," he replied. They stood for a beat longer than necessary. Then she gave a small nod and walked to her car. He watched her go, heart full of something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was hope. It was the beginning of something that might outlast the whispers, something stronger than small-town rumors, maybe even stronger than grief. The air that evening carried the scent of fresh soil and honeysuckle, a mild breeze rustling the tall grass that edged Eric's small backyard. The sun had long dipped below the rooftops, but the sky still held onto a soft blue glow tinged with orange near the horizon. In the quiet that followed bedtime, Eric sat on the back porch with a mug in his hand and a light flannel pulled over his shoulders. He didn't often take the time to sit like this. There was always laundry to fold, dishes to wash, bills to read. But tonight, for reasons he didn't fully understand, he had lit the citronella candle and brought out 2 mugs instead of 1. Maya had fallen asleep quickly, her arms wrapped around her stuffed fox, still buzzing from the thrill of having her teacher visit the house. After checking on her twice, Eric had given up trying to busy himself with chores. Something in him had been still since Lila left earlier that evening. Not in a heavy way, more like the kind of stillness that settles after a song ends, and silence feels fuller than sound. He hadn't expected her to return, but when he heard the soft crunch of gravel on the front path and the gentle knock on the screen door a few minutes after 9, he wasn't surprised. It felt right, like a second verse to a melody still playing. Lila stood on the porch with her hands tucked into the sleeves of her cardigan. Her hair was down now, loose around her shoulders, and her shoes were off. She had brought her own mug this time. "I realized I never drank my tea," she said quietly, holding it up. Eric smiled and stepped aside to let her in. "Backyard's quiet. Fireflies are just starting to show up." She followed him through the kitchen, her steps slow and soft. The kind of quiet movement that people make when they aren't sure whether they're entering someone else's life or just passing through. He held the door open and gestured to the extra chair he'd pulled out earlier, the cushion still warm from the sun. They sat for a few minutes without speaking. The wind stirred the leaves above them, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Lila cupped her mug in both hands and stared into the steam. "I don't know why I came back," she said finally. Eric glanced over at her. "I'm glad you did." She let out a breath, not quite a laugh, more like the sound of surrender. "I've been thinking about you, about today, about how ridiculous it is that 2 grown people can't talk without everyone assuming the worst. It's a small town," he said, "and people love a story. Especially one they didn't earn the right to tell," she added. He nodded slowly, then looked out across the yard. "I used to think small towns meant kindness, but it's really just that everything's louder when the space is smaller. She smiled at that, though it didn't quite erase the weariness in her face. She leaned back and stretched her legs out, her toes brushing the edge of the porch floor. The night seemed to wrap around them like a thin blanket, not enough to chase away the chill, but just enough to make the moment feel contained. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, after a long pause. "Before it all changed?" Eric took a sip of his coffee, though it had gone tepid. "I do. Not in the way I thought I would. I don't miss my marriage. I miss believing it would work. That kind of hope. It's different now." "Different how?" He searched for the words. "Now, hope feels more like a slow burn, not a firework, not something explosive and instant, just steady." Lila turned her head and studied him for a moment. "That's a good way to put it." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "When Ben died, I didn't cry at first. Not for a while. People expected me to, so I tried to. But it felt like if I started, I wouldn't stop. So I didn't." Eric looked at her gently. "When did you?" "2 months later," she said. "In a grocery store. I was buying grapes, of all things. I reached for the same brand he used to eat, and suddenly my hands were shaking so hard I dropped the whole bunch. I just stood there, sobbing in the produce aisle." He nodded, not out of politeness, but because he understood. He'd cried over spilled cereal once. Maya had knocked over her bowl one morning, and he remembered staring at the milk soaking into the floorboards like it was something sacred being wasted. Lila smiled faintly. "I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm telling you all this." "Because I'm listening," he said. The wind picked up a little, brushing through the trees with a hushed sigh. Eric stood and disappeared inside for a moment, returning with a worn quilt folded over his arm. He draped it across the backs of their chairs, letting the fabric fall evenly between them. "Thanks," she said softly. "Can't have you freezing on my porch," he replied. She pulled it tighter around herself. "You really are decent, you know. Not the flashy kind of good, just quietly decent. It's rare." Eric looked down, smiling in that way people do when they've heard something that unsettles them in a good way. "I just try to be the kind of person Maya can be proud of." "She already is," Lila said. They fell quiet again, but it wasn't empty. The silence felt companionable now, something shared rather than avoided. Eric tilted his head back and looked up at the stars. They were faint tonight, scattered across the sky like sand on dark velvet. The moon hung low and pale, a silent observer. "I used to sit out here with my mom," he said. "She would make hot chocolate, and we'd count satellites. She swore you could always tell a satellite because it moved in a straight line, no blinking. She was always looking for something that didn't disappear." Lila leaned back and followed his gaze. "I like that. Finding something steady, something that stays." Eric turned to her then, and for a long moment neither of them looked away. He could see the lines of exhaustion under her eyes, the faint shadows of sorrow that hadn't completely left. But he could also see the quiet strength she wore, like a second skin. The part of her that still showed up every day, still cared for children, still smiled even when the smiles were heavy to carry. She shifted slightly, her shoulder brushing his under the quilt. He didn't move. "If I stayed for 5 more minutes," she said, "would that be too long?" "Not at all," he answered. Their hands rested on the shared edge of the blanket, close but not touching. The warmth between them was subtle, like the glow of a candle in a dark room. Neither of them spoke again for a while. They didn't need to. The silence, the night, the nearness all of it said what words couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But the porch light stayed on, and the fireflies blinked around them, and for the first time in a long while, the ache in both their hearts felt just a little less lonely. The next week brought a cold snap that turned the leaves brittle before they had time to fall. The morning air carried a sharper chill, and the kindergarten hallway smelled of damp jackets and overwashed scarves. Eric arrived early to drop Maya off, partly out of habit, partly because he liked seeing her settle in before the bell rang. But mostly, he had come to see if Lila would look at him the same way she had the night they shared the quilt. He lingered near the cubbies as Maya hung her backpack and bounded toward the reading nook, where her classmates were already gathering. Lila stood near the art table, arranging trays of finger paint, her hands moving methodically but without joy. Her usual calm smile didn't come when she caught sight of him. She looked surprised, then cautious, and something about that shift put a knot in his stomach. He waited until the kids were occupied before walking over. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice low. She gave him a polite nod, but didn't meet his eyes. "Hi." It wasn't cold, exactly. It was the tone someone uses when they don't know if they're being watched. Eric looked around. A few parents still lingered by the door. One woman whispered to another as she zipped her daughter's jacket. Their glances were quick, but unmistakable. Lila stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't talk here." Eric frowned. "Did something happen?" She hesitated, brushing her hair behind her ear. "Mrs. Bailey asked me to come to her office yesterday." "What for?" "She said there have been ongoing concerns. Questions about professionalism, about boundaries. She didn't accuse me of anything outright, but the message was clear." He felt his chest tighten. "You've done nothing wrong. That doesn't matter," she said. "Not to people looking for a story." He glanced at the children, then back to her. "Is this about me?" "It's about both of us," she said quietly. "They're saying I give Maya too much attention, that I favor her, that I've blurred the line between teacher and parent." "That's ridiculous," he said, louder than he intended. A couple of heads turned, and he stepped back, lowering his voice. "You're one of the most thoughtful people I've ever met. This is just noise." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and her eyes were filled with something like pain. "I know you mean that, and I appreciate it, but this job, it's the only stable thing I've had since Ben died. I worked so hard to rebuild after him. I can't lose it." He wanted to say more, to argue, to ask her why the truth wasn't enough to silence the whispers. But he also saw the fear in her eyes, the way she hugged her elbows and stood straighter than usual, like she was bracing herself against something larger than both of them. "I'm not asking you to disappear," she said. "I'm just asking, can we keep this quiet, at least for now?" Eric swallowed the heat rising in his chest. "Of course, whatever you need." That night, the weight of the conversation followed him home. He made grilled cheese for dinner, which Maya called her happiness sandwich, but he barely tasted his. He let her pick the bedtime story, some book about a bear who didn't want to hibernate, and tucked her in with the usual kiss on the forehead. When she asked if Miss Grant was okay, he told her yes. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. After she fell asleep, he stepped out onto the porch, mug in hand, though he hadn't bothered making coffee. The air was colder now. He didn't bring the quilt this time. He stared at the stars but didn't count satellites. His mind spun through all the conversations he'd had over the last few weeks, all the small choices that had seemed innocent, thoughtful, good. Now they felt like evidence, not of wrongdoing, but of vulnerability, as if every gesture, every shared moment, could be twisted into something else under the wrong light. The next day, when he walked into the office at work, a message blinked on his phone. Unknown number, no subject, just a single line. "You and the teacher make a cute pair. Hope Maya's grades reflect that." He stared at it for a long time, thumb hovering over the screen. His first instinct was to reply, to lash out, to demand who sent it, but there was no point. Whoever it was had already made their intention clear. It wasn't a real accusation. It was a warning, the kind meant to sting without being direct enough to confront. He deleted the message and shoved the phone into his desk drawer. That evening, he went to the school again, but not to see Lila. He had received a note from the principal asking for a brief meeting regarding parent involvement and classroom boundaries. The wording was polite, but the meaning was obvious. Mrs. Bailey sat behind her desk with her hands folded, her expression one of strained professionalism. "Mr. Logan," she began, "thank you for coming in. This won't take long." "I'm happy to talk," he said, though he wasn't. She leaned forward slightly. "I want to be clear that your involvement with the school is appreciated. Maya is a wonderful student, but there have been observations." "What kind of observations?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "There's concern that personal relationships with staff, especially with Miss Grant, may be blurring the lines between parent and educator. It's important we maintain equitable treatment in the classroom." Eric tried to bite back his frustration. "So, being kind is now a problem?" "No one is questioning your intentions," she said. "But appearances matter. I'm simply asking that you refrain from any further informal interactions with Miss Grant during school hours." He wanted to argue. He wanted to say that this was about adults being bitter, not children being affected. But he also knew that anything he said could be misinterpreted. He nodded once, tight and clipped. Understood. That night, he didn't go out to the porch. He didn't text Lila. He didn't know what to say that wouldn't just add to the pressure on her shoulders. But around 9:30, a message came anyway. "I heard you were called in. I'm sorry. I never wanted this to land on you." He read it several times before answering. "You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault." He didn't expect a reply, but a few minutes later, it came. "This is harder than I thought it would be." He stared at those words for a long time. He could feel the distance growing, not because they wanted it, but because the world around them was pulling it apart thread by thread. But after a moment, he typed back one more thing. "I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you ask me to." The typing bubbles appeared, then vanished, then returned. "I won't ask you to go." It wasn't a solution. It didn't fix the problem. But it was something solid in a week that had felt like nothing but shifting ground, and for now, that was enough to hold on to. Lila stood in front of her bathroom mirror, hands pressed to the porcelain sink, breathing in slow, shaky gulps. Her eyes were red, not from fresh tears, but from the weight of holding them back all day. She had become good at that. Years of smiling through grief, of standing in front of classrooms while her heart quietly ached beneath her sweater, had taught her how to carry sadness like a purse slung over one's shoulder. Always there, always heavy, but manageable if she kept moving. But now, after the quiet scolding from the principal and the whispers that chased her down hallways like wind through trees, she felt the old ache turn into something different: shame. That hollow throb of knowing she had done nothing wrong, and still somehow was being made to feel guilty, as if kindness itself were an offense. As if remembering someone she had lost, and letting herself feel something new in the same breath, was too much for the world to accept. She opened the drawer and reached for the small wooden box tucked near the back. Inside were folded letters and photos, keepsakes of a life that had once been whole. She unfolded one of them now, a card from Ben with goofy handwriting and a coffee stain in the corner. The words were simple. "You make ordinary days feel like spring." He had left it for her on the kitchen table the morning of their 3rd anniversary, along with a bundle of yellow tulips. That was the last time they had spent a full day together. She folded the card and placed it gently back inside. Her fingers brushed another paper tucked between the old birthday notes. It was different-lined paper, not cardstock. Her brow furrowed as she opened it and read the messy, slanted letters. The note wasn't from Ben. It was from Maya. It had been slipped into her purse earlier that week, and she had forgotten it was there. Probably a classroom doodle, something cheerful and full of rainbows, but this was different. It was short, written in blue crayon with careful intent. "Dear Miss Grant, my daddy brings flowers because he gets nervous. I think he likes you. Please don't be mad. Love. Maya." Lila stared at the note for a long moment, then sat down on the closed lid of the toilet, the letter trembling in her hands. Something about it broke her in a way nothing else had. Not the principal's warning, not the whispers, not even her own doubts. But this gentle honesty from a 5-year-old was too much. She smiled through tears, not because the message was funny, but because it was true. She had seen Eric's awkwardness that day, his hesitation, the way he had offered the tulips like a man unsure of how to express something kind without risking embarrassment. He had no idea what that moment would mean to her. He had only wanted to show respect. And perhaps, just beneath that, he had wanted to connect. And she had. She had felt it, too. She folded the note and held it to her chest for a moment. Then, without letting herself think too much, she grabbed her phone and typed a message. I found something Maya gave me. I think we need to talk. Not about what we can't do, but about what we want to do if we weren't afraid. She didn't send it, not yet. Instead, she placed the phone on her nightstand and turned out the light. She lay awake for hours, listening to the soft hum of her old radiator, thinking about the last 4 years, about how much of her life had been shaped by fear of forgetting and fear of remembering. She thought about how she had spent so long trying to live small so she wouldn't break anything around her, but now there was something new in her chest. Not just the ache of grief, but the hum of hope, quiet and persistent. Meanwhile, across town, Eric sat at his dining room table, surrounded by Maya's art supplies. He was helping her decorate a shoebox for her school's kindness mail project. The idea was simple. Students could write kind notes to each other and drop them into decorated boxes. At the end of the week, the teachers would deliver them like letters. Maya had chosen to cover her box in stars and glitter, and now his fingers were speckled in gold. You have glue on your nose, Maya giggled, pointing. Eric wiped at it with the back of his hand, smearing it more. Is it gone? She shook her head, still laughing. He let her have the moment. It had been a long week, and her joy was a balm. As they finished, Maya looked up at him and asked, Are you still sad? The question caught him off guard. Sad? Because of the mean people at school, and because you like Miss Grant, and now you don't get to talk to her anymore. He swallowed. I'm not sad. Just trying to do the right thing. But the right thing should make you happy, she said, her voice serious in that way children sometimes get when they're wiser than they have words for. Miss Grant looked sad too, like when you forget your umbrella and it rains. Eric smiled, but something in him cracked a little. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. You're a good kid, you know that? She nodded, with complete confidence. I know. After putting her to bed, he sat back down and stared at the note Maya had written for her project. It was addressed to Miss Grant and read, Thank you for helping me learn big words and for liking my daddy even when he is nervous. He laughed softly, then let out a long breath and closed his eyes. He didn't need confirmation. He knew deep down that what they shared, however fragile and undefined, was real. Not a distraction, not a rebound, but something honest. He opened his laptop and began to write. Not a letter to Lila, but a journal entry, a way to get the things out of his head before they began to harden into regrets. I don't know what happens next. Maybe this is just a chapter, not the story, but I know what I feel. And I know I'd rather be laughed at for bringing someone flowers than spend another year wondering what might have happened if I didn't. He saved the file and shut the lid. Later that night, after brushing her teeth and folding her laundry into neat stacks she wouldn't touch for days, Lila picked up her phone again. She opened the message she'd written earlier, reread it, then tapped send before she could talk herself out of it. The reply came 5 minutes later. Let's talk. Tomorrow after pickup. Your call. She smiled. This time, she didn't cry. She folded Maya's letter and placed it next to Ben's card inside her keepsake box. 2 truths, side by side. She didn't have to choose between past and present. She could carry both. The parking lot was half empty by the time Eric pulled in the next afternoon. Pickup had ended 20 minutes ago, and most of the other parents were already gone. The usual cluster of SUVs and minivans replaced by a few staff cars and scattered bicycles. The late sunlight cast long shadows across the pavement, and the air had that crisp edge that hinted at the end of autumn. He sat for a moment, with the engine off, gripping the steering wheel. His heart beat faster than it should have. Not because he didn't want to see her, he did, but because something was shifting between them, and he could feel it. There was no undoing it now. They had moved past the safe outer ring of polite conversation, past accidental kindness and unspoken memories. Now it was a choice, a step forward or a step away. He wasn't sure which one she wanted. He wasn't even sure what he was ready for. The sound of footsteps on gravel pulled his attention toward the school doors. Lila walked out slowly, arms crossed against the chill. Her hair was loose again, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore a gray coat over a burgundy sweater and jeans, and there was something quietly determined in the way she moved. Not rushed, not hesitant, like someone walking toward a decision they had made hours ago. Eric got out and shut the door gently behind him. They met halfway across the lot, stopping near a bench shaded by a thin maple tree whose last few leaves clung stubbornly to their branches. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "I wasn't sure I'd know what to say," he replied. She smiled a little at that, then looked past him, out toward the street. "I've been thinking a lot since I sent that message, about what's been happening and what we've been doing. I realized something." He waited, watching her. "I've spent so much of my life trying not to be too much," she said. "Too emotional, too attached, too broken. After Ben died, I told myself I couldn't afford to fall apart, because falling apart meant losing control. And if I lost control, I'd lose everything else, too. My job, my sense of purpose, my place in the world." Eric nodded slowly, letting her speak. "But that morning, when you handed me those tulips, something cracked open," she continued. "It wasn't just grief. It was the memory of being seen, of being loved. Not romantically, just acknowledged. I didn't realize how much I missed that." She looked at him then, her eyes clear and steady. "I think you've been carrying something too. Not grief the same way, but something close." "I lost the picture," he said. "The one I had in my head of what life was supposed to look like. Marriage, family, stability. When Maya's mom left, she didn't just take herself. She took that whole picture with her. I've been trying to draw a new one ever since." Lila stepped closer, their shadows overlapping on the pavement. "Maybe we both need to stop trying to fix the old pictures." He let out a breath. "Maybe it's time to paint something new." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Maya wrote this for me. You probably didn't know." She handed it to him. The writing was unmistakably Maya's, large and crooked letters, spaced with the careful intention of someone still learning how to spell. "Thank you for helping me learn big words and for liking my daddy even when he is nervous." Eric laughed softly, the sound catching in his throat. "She's a wise one," Lila said, "and honest." He folded the note and tucked it into his jacket pocket. "She's been asking if we're a family now." Lila's eyes widened slightly. "What did you say?" "I told her maybe we're becoming one." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind catching the hem of her coat. "I'm not ready to call this anything," she said. "I don't want to rush. I'm still afraid." "I'm not asking you to name it," Eric replied. "I'm just asking if you want to keep walking with me, even if it's slowly, even if we have to duck behind PTA meetings and smile politely at gossip." She gave a soft laugh. "You make it sound like we're secret agents." "We might have to be," he said. "For now." She stepped in closer, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath in the space between them. "If I kiss you right now, will you tell anyone?" "Only if you want me to," he said. She didn't hesitate. Her hand reached up, touching the side of his face gently. Then she leaned in, and their lips met soft, unsure at first, then steady. It wasn't fiery or frantic. It was quiet and certain. A kiss that didn't rush to prove anything but simply stayed, like a promise made in the language neither of them had spoken in years. When they pulled apart, she looked up at him and smiled. That felt like something more than just kindness. He rested his forehead against hers. It felt like starting over. They stayed like that for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle. Not the kiss, not the attraction, but the vulnerability of choosing to try again, of letting someone new see the parts you once protected behind grief and shame. Lila pulled back, just enough to look him in the eyes. Tomorrow, I'll probably worry again. About parents, about perception, about whether I'm making a mistake. He nodded. You probably will. But tonight, she said, I just want to sit in what this is, whatever this is. He reached for her hand, took it gently, and felt her fingers lace through his. Then let's sit in it, as long as you want. They walked back toward the cars, hand in hand, not worried about who might see. The wind had quieted. The light was fading fast. But something inside them was just beginning to glow. Not bright, not loud, but steady, like a candle held between two people brave enough to protect it from the wind. When Eric got home, Maya was already in bed. He checked on her as always, brushing the hair from her forehead and tucking the blanket around her small frame. As he turned to leave, her voice came sleepily from the dark. Did you see Miss Grant? He smiled to himself. Yeah, I did. Is she still sad? He thought about how Lila had smiled, how she had kissed him, and how steady her voice had been afterward. No, he said softly, not tonight. She nodded against her pillow. Good. Eric closed the door gently behind him, heart full and quiet. And for the first time in a long time, he believed that maybe love wasn't something that came all at once. Maybe it arrived in pieces, like a note written in crayon, a memory tucked in a pocket, and a kiss that asked nothing but honesty. Maybe it didn't need to be perfect. Just real. The day of parent night arrived with a kind of quiet tension. At school, the energy was different, more rehearsed. Hallways that usually echoed with playful shrieks and muddy sneakers now held a kind of stillness, interrupted only by the soft scuff of polished shoes and the clink of coffee urns being set out in the multipurpose room. Art projects hung neatly on the walls. Lila walked past each one, straightening edges and retaping corners that curled from the humid air. The smell of markers and sugar cookies filled the space. She wore a soft green dress and a silver chain Ben had given her long ago. It felt like a gesture toward the person she used to be, and a quiet nod to who she was becoming. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore simple makeup, just enough to look fresh without feeling artificial, but the nerves under her skin pulsed all the same. This was her fourth parent night at this school. In the past, it had always been a straightforward evening. Greet the parents, answer the usual questions, present the class's progress, and give a small speech about the importance of collaboration between families and teachers. But this year was different. This year, whispers had floated through the school like a draft no one could quite find the source of. And although things had quieted recently, she still felt eyes on her when she walked the halls. Still, she wasn't afraid. Not tonight. Eric arrived with Maya a few minutes before the start time. Maya had insisted on bringing the kindness mailbox she'd decorated, even though it wasn't required. She marched proudly beside her dad, her backpack bouncing with every step. Eric looked freshly shaven and wore a button-down shirt that Maya had ironed or attempted to. One sleeve still had a small fold line, and he hadn't noticed. But he looked confident, not because of his clothes, but because of the way he held himself, as if he had stopped apologizing for being visible. When Lila spotted them from across the room, her breath caught. not out of nerves, but from the way her heart recognized something it didn't have to hide from anymore. She greeted other parents as they filtered in, exchanging polite nods and warm, practiced smiles. But her eyes drifted to Eric now and then, and when their glances met, something unspoken passed between them. Something warm, something steady. The room filled quickly. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as parents settled in. Children clustered along the back wall where a volunteer had set up a reading table. A few students had been chosen to speak about their favorite projects, and Maya had been one of them. She clutched her drawing of the tulip garden and whispered her lines under her breath, lips moving with great care. Lila stepped forward and stood at the front of the room. The chatter quieted. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear, calm. "Thank you all for being here. It means a lot to your children and to us as a school that you've taken the time to show up." She paused to let the silence settle. "I want to start tonight not by talking about test scores or curriculum goals, but about what your children have taught me. In the last few months, I've seen kindness take root in this classroom in ways that humbled me. I've seen students comfort each other after a hard day, help pick up spilled paint without being asked, and write notes of encouragement to classmates who were too shy to speak out loud." She glanced toward Maya, who beamed back at her. "One of those notes," Lila continued, "reminded me that the little things we does, especially the quiet ones, can mean more than we think. Sometimes we think we have to be perfect, polished, untouchable. But your children remind me every day that vulnerability and honesty are part of growing, too." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some parents leaned forward, others smiled. The tension she had carried into the room slowly began to melt. "I also want to acknowledge that I've made mistakes, not in my care for your children, which remains unwavering, but perhaps in assuming that kindness would always be understood. I've learned that even the best intentions need clarity and conversation. I hope that tonight can be part of that." She paused again, this time letting her gaze rest briefly on Eric. He gave the faintest nod, just enough for her to feel grounded. "We've started a class garden," she went on. "The children picked their favorite flowers to grow. Not because they'll bloom right away, or because they're easy, but because they remind them of home, of stories, of people they love. I want this classroom to feel like that, too. A place where things grow slowly, maybe even awkwardly, but always with purpose." A gentle round of applause rose up, warm and sincere. When it faded, Lila called the children up to share their projects. Maya was the last to speak. She stepped to the front with her tulip drawing clutched in both hands. "My favorite flower is a yellow tulip," she said, "because my daddy brought some to school and it made Miss Grant cry. But not in a bad way, in a memory way. So I planted one in the garden because I think flowers can help people feel better when their hearts hurt." Lila blinked hard as the room sat in stunned silence for a breath. Then a soft awe broke the quiet, followed by a chuckle and scattered claps. Eric lowered his head, a mix of pride and amusement playing across his face. After the presentations, parents mingled near the tables, nibbling cookies and asking questions. Lila moved between them with ease, the speech having lifted something from her shoulders. One of the moms, who had previously looked at her with guarded skepticism, came over now, smiling. "That was a beautiful message," she said. "Thank you for saying what you did. I think we all needed that." Lila offered a grateful smile. "Thank you. I appreciate that more than you know." As the crowd thinned, Eric walked over with Maya clinging to his side. Lila crouched down and hugged the little girl. "You did such a good job," she said. "I'm so proud of you." Maya leaned in close. "Did it help? The tulip story?" "It helped a lot," Lila said, eyes glistening. When Maya skipped off to grab another cookie, Eric stepped closer. "You handled that with more grace than I think I ever could." She tilted her head at him. "And you looked calm through the whole thing." "I was faking," he whispered. She laughed, And for a moment, they just stood in the middle of the nearly empty room, the kind of silence between them that felt earned, not awkward. "I'm glad you came," she said softly. "I always will," he replied. Later, just before the last of the chairs were folded and the lights turned off, Lila and Eric stood near the door, watching the tulip drawings flutter slightly in the draft from an open window. One, in particular, had been taped to the center of the garden wall, a yellow tulip drawn in crayon with 3 stick figures underneath it, a little girl in the middle and 2 grown-ups on either side. The caption, written in uneven letters, read, "Family is when you help each other bloom." Neither of them said a word. They didn't have to. The drawing said enough. A year later, the garden bloomed again. Yellow tulips stood tall in the corner of the school courtyard, their green stems straight and full under the morning sun. The class had planted more flowers, that spring lavender, daisies, and a few wild sunflowers that leaned heavily to one side, but the tulips remained the heart of it. They were Maya's favorites still, and every time she passed them, she would glance toward her teacher's window and smile. It was Parent Appreciation Day again. Maya was a first grader now, with longer legs and a faster stride, and she no longer needed Eric to walk her all the way to the door. But that morning, she had asked him to come anyway. She wore her yellow sweater, the one with the tiny flower buttons, and held a handmade card tucked into a bright envelope. She hummed as they walked, something cheerful and familiar, and Eric couldn't help but match her rhythm. He carried a new bouquet, yellow tulips again, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. They weren't from a grocery store this time. He had picked them himself from a small farm outside of town where the owner had let him walk the rows with shears in hand, choosing each stem with care. The man hadn't asked why he was doing it, only nodded and handed him the string with a smile. At the school doors, Maya tugged his sleeve. "Do you think she'll cry again?" she asked. Eric smiled, shifting the bouquet to one arm so he could hold her hand. "Maybe, but I think this time, if she does, it'll be the good kind." Maya thought about that. "Miss Grant says there's no bad kind of crying, just the kind that helps and the kind that waits. She's a smart woman." Maya beamed and walked a little taller. Inside the classroom, the energy was light. Kids were already giggling over their handmade gifts and poems taped to desks. Lila moved from table to table with a quiet joy, crouching to speak to her students, offering hugs where they were needed and praise where it counted. She didn't notice Eric at first, but when she looked up and saw him standing just inside the doorway, bouquet in hand, her smile widened without hesitation. He stepped forward and offered the tulips like a ritual, one they both knew by heart now. "For you," he said. She took them, brushing her fingers against his for a moment longer than necessary. "You remembered. Every year," he said. "Every year I'll bring them, not to replace what came before, just to honor what still matters." She held the flowers to her chest. "Then I'll always make room for them." Maya bounced on her toes. "Can I give her the card now?" Lila crouched again, and Maya placed the envelope carefully into her hands. "I drew us in it," she said. "Me, you, and Daddy, and the garden, and our dog, even though we don't have one yet." Lila laughed, her eyes already misting. "I figured we might," Maya added. Eric glanced at the other parents in the room. Some of them were familiar, others new. There were no whispers this year. If there were any judgments, they had long since faded into something quieter. Most people had come to accept what was now clear to everyone. Eric and Lila were a part of each other's lives. Not in scandal, not in secret, just in the ordinary, beautiful way people sometimes find one another again after they think all the doors are closed. After the classroom celebration, Lila took her break and joined Eric outside in the courtyard. They sat on the bench near the garden, watching as the breeze moved through the flowers. Maya had been pulled into a game of hopscotch nearby and was already laughing with a group of second graders. "Do you remember the first time you came here with tulips?" Lila asked. He nodded. "You cried." "I sobbed," she corrected, "in front of half the PTA. You made me question everything I knew about giving gifts." She laughed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But you didn't stop." "No," he said, "because I saw you, and something in me recognized you." She looked up at him. "You helped me carry something I thought I'd be stuck holding forever." "You did the same for me," he said, "just by letting me stay." A breeze caught the hem of her dress, and she pulled the tulips closer to her chest. "This still scares me sometimes." He nodded. "Me too. But it's the kind of scared that means something, the kind that reminds me I'm alive." He kissed her temple, not out of habit, but as if sealing something sacred. The moment held. Later that evening, back at home, Eric stood in the living room, holding a small envelope. Maya had given it to him after dinner, her face serious in the way only a child's can be when they know they're doing something important. She had written, "To Daddy and Miss Grant," on the front in colorful marker. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence in her uneven handwriting. "Thank you for growing our family, one flower at a time." He sat down on the edge of the couch and stared at the words, feeling them settle into him like roots, deep and steady, the kind that wouldn't be shaken by wind or time. Lila came in from the kitchen and sat beside him. He handed her the note without speaking. She read it once, then pressed it to her chest. "It's the truth," she said. Eric reached for her hand. "I want to do this forever." She looked at him, eyes shimmering. "Then let's keep planting." That spring, they did, together. Each year, on the same day, Eric brought her tulips. Not because they were the start of something, but because they had become the thread that wove her past into his present. And every year, when the flowers bloomed, they reminded each other that love does not need to replace what came before. It only needs to grow in the light of what remains.